The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Active Transportation Academy webinar. My name is Mike Fitch with the Ohio LTAP Center here at ODOT, and we appreciate your participation. As we get started, please take a moment to locate the questions box in the GoToWebinar panel. During the presentation today, please use the questions box to send in any questions you might have. With that, we will go ahead and turn things over to Amelia Mansfield. Hello.
Hi there, Mike. Thanks for having me here today. Good morning, everybody. Thanks for joining us on a Friday morning. Hope we can get your weekend started off right. So as Mike introduced me, my name is Amelia Mansfield, Planning and Communications Director at Burton Planning Services, and we're working with tool design to assist in managing the Active Transportation Academy. So my roles are helping to manage that. I also create course content, and then I also instruct courses, such as this webinar right now. And if you've been a participant in other courses pre-pandemic, we would have met in person and probably had some lively conversation. So good to see you again. So today, as Mike was saying, just some housekeeping notes to make sure that you keep yourself muted until the Q&A portion during the last 10 to 15 minutes of this webinar. You can enter your questions directly into the chat pod, and any questions that are entered into that pod during today's webinar, we will do our best to answer during the webinar. Otherwise, at the end, there's a slide that has contact information where you can reach out to us and ask follow-up questions, and we'll do our best to respond fully to those questions that we receive after the fact. So today's agenda is here up on the screen. We're going to spend a few minutes just talking about the Active Transportation Academy. Then we will get into the meat of today's topic, which is Safe Routes to School Basics. This is actually modeled after a approximately 3-hour self-guided e-learning course that's available on ODOT's website. We wanted to bring to your attention that that course exists, and that if you hear things today that are really interesting or intriguing to you and you want to know more, you can always navigate to ODOT's e-learning page and find the course there and take it free at your own pace. There are 3 modules, and it'll take you just a little bit under 3 hours to go through that at whatever pace you want to do it. And then today we'll also educate you and teach you about some things that you maybe didn't know before, or refresh your memory on. Hoping to add some safe routes to school. Start with the introduction to the topic of safe routes to school, and then we'll go into what some tools are that can help you with your planning and implementation and funding. And then we'll end with questions and answers. So I'm going to take my camera off, and you can just focus on the subject matter of the slides moving forward. If I can figure out how to turn that off. Okay, here we go. Okay, so the Active Transportation Academy is something that most of you are probably familiar with. You've either participated or heard of it. It's been around for almost 5 years now, and the purpose is to offer training to help communities such as yours to reach your active transportation goals. And this is all done during free trainings and workshops, and it's open to any local jurisdiction in Ohio, and that could be anything from schools to local government entities and in between. There are professional development credits available for the attendees that participate in those courses, which is always helpful. And if you want to know more, you can always click on the link in this presentation to take you there, or just Google ODOT Active Transportation Academy. And I don't remember if Mike mentioned it, but in the chat portal there is actually a handout that is a copy of this presentation, and the links should be clickable within there. So through the Active Transportation Academy, we offer a variety of different course offerings. They range from instructor-led trainings that are either in person or virtual. community workshops, which are meant to be more tailored to your specific community and the active transportation planning needs and efforts that you have going on. There are e-learning courses available that I mentioned, and there's also material that's archived from prior courses that aren't as popular now, but the information is still relevant and accessible to you. So those instructor-led trainings are listed here. These are all, I would say, like 101 courses, if you will, and also train the trainer. So for example, the crossing guard training is a train the trainer type of event where anyone in a school district who would be interested in having new crossing guards, they would take this course and then they would then be able to train future crossing guards that come through their school. So that's just one example of what those instructor-led trainings might be like. We have community workshops. These are the ones that I said are more tailored to your community's needs and data that's specific to your community. There are 3 of them that we currently have available, and then a conducting walk audits workshop is coming soon. We have e-learnings, and they're listed here. Some of them are duplicative of the in-person trainings and workshops. Some of them are prerequisites for workshops, such as the Active Transportation Basics course and the Safe Routes to School Basics course. And we ask that someone who's in the host community to host those workshops take the course beforehand. That way they have a general understanding of what the topic is that we're going over, and then we can move ahead from the 101 and get right into the nitty-gritty of whatever the workshop's goals are. If you're interested in e-learnings, once again, you can go to ODOT's e-learning portal and you can find them listed there. Archive material, here's a list of what's available there. This includes everything from presentations to handouts, things that you can take a look at, and always follow up with us if you have questions. If you're interested in participating in or hosting a training or a workshop, we have a Formstack form on the ODOT Active Transportation Academy webpage, and it's pretty simple. Put some contact information in there, share with us what you're currently working on and what your goals might be, and then someone will be in touch to work out scheduling that for you. So again, free of charge. We are eager to host these again, and we are happy to do them virtually until people are comfortable with them being in person. So we're going to get into the subject matter for today. So just as a refresher, this is twofold with purpose for today. It's one, just to give you an understanding of what that Safe Routes to School Basics webinar, e-learning course entails, but also to actually hopefully teach you some things and refresh your memory on some things, knowing that the funding cycle for Safe Routes to School is approaching, and with the school year approaching, it's more just naturally on people's minds anyway. So we felt this was good timing. So what is Safe Routes to School? Most of you are probably familiar with this term. There's actually a legitimate definition, and it's listed here on the page. But you know, if you have been involved with planning initiatives such as any type of active transportation planning, safety studies, or just general transportation planning, you're going to notice a lot of similarities with what is entailed in Safe Routes to School planning and implementation. One of the main differences, though, is the focus on specifically the travel between students' homes and the school itself. And there are obviously repercussions and benefits to the surrounding community, but it really does have that focus on the students and their ability to get to and from school safely. So 2 considerations for Safe Routes to School are planning and funding, and we're going to get into these a little bit more here, but I just want you to keep in mind that planning for Safe Routes to School requires a holistic or comprehensive approach, and it includes both infrastructure and programming initiatives. A lot of times in more traditional planning, it's more of a focus on infrastructure or actual development, but with Safe Routes to School, there's also an emphasis on education and engagement as well. Safe Routes to School is also the name of a specific funding program offered by the Ohio Department of Transportation for projects that enable and encourage children in grades K through 8 to walk and bike to school safely. And at the end today, during our Q&A session, we're going to have Kate Harley, who's the Safe Routes to School manager for ODOT, available to talk more specifically about any questions you might have regarding ODOT's funding program for Safe Routes to School. So let's talk a little bit about the benefits and the challenges of safe routes to school and why we, or not of safe routes to school, but of walking and safety in our communities and why we need safe routes to school to ensure that children are able to get to and from school safely. So one reason is that our transportation patterns aren't always conducive to safe walking and biking or the easiest path to get to a school. And so there are actually fewer school walkers and bicyclists now than there were in the 60s. And some of the reasons for this are that people are either living farther away from schools than they used to, or they're living in an environment that's a little bit more car-centric, if you will. And so some of these issues can be addressed by Safe Routes to Schools initiatives, as we'll talk about later, and some other ones can be addressed through your other planning initiatives. Also, compared to the 60s, we live a more sedentary lifestyle. I'm sure this isn't a surprise to all of you. And so as a result of this, we've seen incidences of chronic disease increasing, not only in adults, but also in our children populations, obesity, asthma, other breathing issues. And so being able to provide a safe way for children to walk and bike to school could have additional benefits on health. And then finally, we have the actual safety concerns of street crossings, lack of sidewalks, gaps and breaks in those types of infrastructure, and it may not feel safe to walk or bike to school, or it may not actually be practical to do it. Oh, I'm sorry, the slide wasn't correlating, so that's what that slide was. Here we go. So the ODOT Safe Routes to School program has some specific goals. This is to provide funding specifically for projects, like I mentioned before, that encourage and enable students who are in grades K through 8 to walk or ride their bikes to school. And ODOT also provides a variety of resources to assist communities and entities such as yours with developing school travel plans and collecting data and identifying different countermeasures and providing funding. And so communities can receive project funding for either infrastructure or non-infrastructure projects. Again, that's a really important distinction. And infrastructure projects can include anything from engineering related projects such as improving crosswalks and sidewalks, to non-infrastructure projects like facilitating different educational programs and different encouragement contests and whatnot. And communities can also seek assistance for school travel plans if they don't have the capacity to develop them themselves. And so that's a really great benefit. Not all entities have that ability or resources to do so. So project eligibility requirements when you might be interested in utilizing ODOT Safe Routes to School program are really important to keep in mind. So first off, any ODOT funded project must meet the program goals, which we just talked about. And so generally to enable and encourage students to walk or bike to school safely. The specific project you're applying for also must be identified in either a school travel plan or an active transportation plan or an equivalent plan approved by ODOT. So that planning focus is really integral. And then additionally, any infrastructure projects must be within about 2 miles of a school serving the K through 8 population. So if those aren't already included in part of an existing plan, you'll have to document information on student travel and parent input. And ODOT actually makes these types of efforts pretty easy by providing different templates for a student travel tally survey and parent surveys. And then your communities can choose to collect your data from in-person interactions or online. There's a lot of flexibility built in there. And then in addition, plans that are referenced in Safe Routes to School project applications must have been updated within the past 5 years. And so that's pretty typical horizon period for a plan, but sometimes things get in the way and that doesn't happen. But for Safe Routes to School funding through ODOT, that's really important. And then to be competitive for project funding through ODOT's program, a majority of the students should live within the 2 miles of the school, but of course, the overall competitive depends on the number and the strength of other applications that come through, and then as well as the overall cost compared to the potential impact of the program, or of the project, excuse me. So these are things that Kate would have a lot of guidance on. So whether you're interested in asking those questions during today's webinar or following up separately, she's a really great resource to be able to make sure you're meeting all of those eligibility requirements. So for infrastructure projects, funding is available for any phase of the project, such as engineering, design, right-of-way planning, construction, and construction engineering. And then for the non-infrastructure projects, eligible types would include things like any variety of education and programming activities, and this could be those that are intended to develop and implement plans, or different programs and policies that are going to help sustain past the availability of that Safe Routes to School funding. So this means that the non-infrastructure funding is intended to help kickstart new programs and projects that are going to be ongoing or expand and either reach more students or involve additional content into the future. So I've already mentioned that ODOT has a lot of resources, but here's a list of some of them that might be of interest to you. And again, you can find that PDF of this presentation in the handouts section of the pod, and you'll be able to click on this link here to be able to get information on a webinar that Kate offers annually, and that's also saved here. That's an overview of the Safe Routes to School program. And then there's also specifically a webinar that Kate hosts that's a funding webinar. And I think that would be really helpful if you're interested in going after ODOT Safe Routes to Schools funds, because she'll cover all of the details and everything you need to know in a step-by-step nature. So the other resources here is that, ODOT not only provides guidance on developing a school travel plan, but they also provide downloadable Word document templates that can be used to fill in all of your local information. You can also design your own plan, but sometimes you just want the path of least resistance, so using the ODOT template might be a good route for you. ODOT also provides mapping services and can actually host the student travel tallies and the parent surveys. They also have other resources which can be used for hosting meetings and conducting walk audits. So you don't have to do this alone. If you are related to an entity that does your own planning, this might be second nature to you, but if you aren't familiar with basic planning principles or haven't led that type of effort before, using ODOT's resources really might be the way to go. ODOT's infrastructure and non-infrastructure toolkit is also something that's great to reference. It outlines examples of different countermeasures that you can use to enable and encourage safe walking and biking to school. You can also request planning assistance each year through the School Travel Plan Development Assistance application. And then we have the Active Transportation Academy, which you're participating in right now in one capacity, but we can also offer you different training and workshops and e-learning opportunities that can help you get started on your school travel plan, or to train your crossing guards, or to start a Girls in Gear bike empowerment program, or you can develop a walking school bus program, all these things that relate to Safe Routes to School. So I've mentioned a school travel plan a few times already, and you might be wondering, what is that? So it's I'm sorry, Okay, so we know that it's a requirement for ODOT funding for Safe Routes to School projects, and so it's basically a written document that outlines your community's intentions for helping students to use active transportation, such as walking or biking, to be able to get to and from school. And so once you complete your STP, you can use it as a foundation for your Safe Routes to School program. So it not only is a requirement for eligibility for funding through ODOT, but it's also there to set your groundwork. It's not just checking boxes, it's actually a very important pillar to your Safe Routes to School planning efforts. So a comprehensive school travel plan is created through what we call a team-based approach, and that involves key community stakeholders, a member of the public that can help identify the areas in your community that are actually serving as barriers to active transportation for the students. And this will ensure that there's more of a comprehensive approach to address those barriers. We're not just using the people that work at the school to identify them. We're not just using the parents and guardians of the students who can't walk or bike to school. We're using a holistic approach of engaging a variety of different stakeholders so that you're not missing any of those different perspectives. School travel plans can also address the needs of either an individual school or multiple schools. So if you are affiliated with a school district or a community that has multiple schools where you might be interested in developing Safe Routes to School projects, this is a really great thing to point out. So the number of schools included in the plan will vary based on your community's needs, the goals of those plans, the capacity to plan and implement projects for a wider geographic area. But if you have the capacity to study an entire school district, it's an opportunity and a way that you can prioritize projects across the district and outline different education and programming that might be implemented district-wide. So here's a list of what is generally included in a school travel plan. I'm not going to read it off to you, but you can see here that it's everything from who's going to be involved in the process and outlining that to having meetings with those stakeholders, setting your visions, collecting data to help identify where those gaps exist or barriers exist to students being able to safely and comfortably walk and bike to school. Actually getting out and walking around the neighborhood with students and parents and guardians and other folks who are familiar with the area and can point out things that aren't working very well with the built environment or the culture of the community, and then figuring out what type of countermeasures or solutions might be appropriate for your school or your school district. Gathering public input through a variety of ways, and then actually putting that plan together. So I've mentioned already that, you know, a school travel plan is really essential. It's something that ODOT requires for Safe Routes to School funding through them. You might be curious to know who is able to apply for these, and so we have that listed here for you. So infrastructure projects typically have applicants who are the actual maintenance authority, if you will, so whomever is going to be responsible for the upkeep of the infrastructure once it's built. So these types of projects are the ones that are actually building things on the ground. So literally bike lanes, sidewalks, crosswalks, things like that, that provide connectivity, that improve safety for the children, that reflect the need that was addressed in your school travel plan, that are going to increase the number of walking and biking trips or students that are doing that. And these projects are going to show the commitment of the community to actually, you know, ensure that they're being used and maintained appropriately. Non-infrastructure projects have an applicant list that is a little bit more broad. So public agencies such as local communities, school districts, health districts, park districts, or nonprofit entities could all apply for non-infrastructure funding for Safe Routes to School. These are the things that are not, you know, literally built on the ground projects. These are things that are ongoing education and outreach initiatives and campaigns, things like walk to school day events, providing crossing guard materials to train the crossing guards, to educate them, providing a local coordinator to actually administer the Safe Routes to School program, things like that. So whomever you are, chances are you are eligible to be an applicant. It'll just depend whether that's for infrastructure projects or non-infrastructure projects. But that's why it's great to have partners throughout the community, because you could always come together and work on both of these types. So the ODOT Safe Routes to School program has different requirements here. So a community can apply for up to 100% of the necessary funding for a project, which is great. This is different than many of ODOT's other programs, so it's really distinct. A community is also able to request funding for all project phases as needed. This means that funding can help you to design your project, acquire your right-of-way, construct it, not just for one of those things, which is really helpful. Or for example, if your community has funds for design already set aside, you may decide that you only want to go after funding for construction, and that's completely okay as well. The program can also provide funding for non-infrastructure projects that support the program goals like we've already talked about. So awards for 100% of funding for all phases are prioritized for communities who need the financial and project assistance the most. And so each year ODOT opens up the application cycle in early January, and applications are available for non-infrastructure projects, infrastructure projects, and the school travel plan. So you'll have to look for those distinctly there. And then infrastructure projects are typically funded for several years out. However, engineering and design can begin right away. And as I talked about previously, you can learn more about this either by asking Kate later in our Q&A or by navigating to ODOT's Safe Routes to School page, and you can view the past webinars on that or sign up for this year's funding webinar. Also here, I guess I hadn't noticed, but I'm sure you've already read what those limits are for applications for different types of projects. So infrastructure up to $400,000 and non-infrastructure up to $60,000. There are other funding programs. So the Active Transportation Academy, which I'm here through today, is an ODOT initiative, and so we focused a lot on ODOT and their resources, and Kate is really wonderful and helpful, and I encourage you to work with her to try to meet your Safe Routes to School needs through funding at ODOT. But there are also other ways that you can fund these types of things, and we didn't want to be remiss and not list them. So you're able to, again, download the PowerPoint and click on some of these. But if you're a member of a metropolitan planning organization, they might have funding for this type of work. It may not even necessarily be called Safe Routes to School. It could be active transportation funding. It could be funding through other types of transportation projects with like a multi-use path on the side or something like that. But you can be creative. There's ODOT's Transportation Alternatives Program, Highway Safety Improvement Program. The Ohio Public Works Commission offers funding for some of these types of projects. We have Ohio Department of Natural Resources. Their Clean Ohio Trails Fund or Recreational Trails Program funds just those types of things, but just because they're under the crux of recreation doesn't mean that they cannot be used for K-8 students to be able to get to and from school. There might be local funding opportunities or even public-private partnerships or sponsorships, and ODOT has a really handy program resource guide that you can click on and gives you more details about all of the different resources that might be useful to you. So now that we've talked about what Safe Routes to School is and specifically about ODOT's program and some other funding programs, we're going to talk a little bit about some tools for Safe Routes to School. If you're an engineer or a planner, this might be of most interest to you. If you are neither of those, this might be brand new information, and I guess you might have some questions to follow up on for these. So I'm sorry, I'm going to click back. Okay, I wanted to make sure that I hadn't skipped a slide. So we talked a lot about non-infrastructure solutions. And I feel like that's a little bit more nebulous than an infrastructure project. And so I wanted to start with this and just say that non-infrastructure initiatives are actually the foundation of a comprehensive Safe Routes to School program. You don't just build a bike lane and then not teach a child how to use it, or you don't just, you know, fix a sidewalk and not put together a walking school bus program. So as some examples there. So when developing non-infrastructure initiatives, the most effective programs look at the school and the community closely and determine the types of programs or policies that are best for that school. And so your school travel plan process might identify what some of those might be. Some of the non-infrastructure activities might include things like walking or bicycling education and activities, walk to school events, student walk audits. So these initiatives could be delivered either during school-wide assemblies, in a classroom setting, an after-school or weekend event with parents and caregivers. So it takes a combination of these initiatives to actually develop the desired culture change, but that's what it's all meant to be. It's meant to support and educate and encourage the families and the children who attend this school or these schools to actually walk and bike when they can. There's some basic principles for designing Safe Routes to School infrastructure solutions for all ages and abilities. And so I wanted to say that before we get into some of these infrastructure countermeasures that are appropriate for Safe Routes to School projects. So even though this is called Safe Routes to Schools, the whole idea is that through these projects and programs, you're actually designing a community that serves the needs of all ages and all abilities. So whether it's, you know, an infant in a stroller or you know, older adult using a mobility aid or anyone in between, these types of amenities are going to serve everybody. So through this, you know, there's the idea of a separation of modes. So you provide options for pedestrians and bicyclists to be separated from vehicular traffic, for example. You incorporate some intuitive design. So what just makes sense in the way that you're designing this infrastructure? You want to make sure that the visibility of children from predominantly motorists is enhanced. So making sure that sight lines are clear and that cars that are driving in these areas are going to notice the children way ahead of time and be able to avoid them. And then incorporating different types of speed management and traffic calming measures. So the idea is you want the traffic to be slower and you want there to be less traffic if possible. So, you know, the first type of infrastructure countermeasure for Safe Routes to School that I wanted to highlight today is probably the most thought of, and this is sidewalks. You think about children walking to school, you think about those visions of the 1960s and kids walking to school. It's on a sidewalk, and that is no different today. This is the most common way that children are walking or biking to school. And in a lot of communities, children under a certain age are supposed to be riding their bike on a sidewalk anyway. So whether they're walking or biking, sidewalks are one of the most common types of infrastructure that children use to get to and from school. So whether or not your community has sidewalks, fixing broken sidewalks, building the missing parts of sidewalks, we've all seen those where a sidewalk goes to nowhere, or installing brand new sidewalks to get to schools is something that Safe Routes to School programs would do. There's also crosswalks and median refuge islands. So, you know, a crosswalk is pretty self-explanatory. Then we have these enhancements to them, which we call median refuge islands, which is a place where if people can't make it all the way across the street to avoid cars, then they have a place where they can safely stop and wait until the traffic passes. So that's another type of Safe Routes to School infrastructure type project that would be eligible for funding. Something that we've all seen pop up around our communities, whether they're rural or suburban or urban, are different types of signals for pedestrians. And so everything from a simple crosswalk signal to these that are listed or shown here where, you know, people push a button and it allows a signal to come about that makes the traffic stop, and then the pedestrian has the right of way. And so this can be helpful in an area where there aren't intersections nearby with, a more natural crosswalk setting, or areas that have a higher traffic. Other types of infrastructure for safe routes to school that might be appropriate in your community are bike lanes or separated bike lanes. So a bike lane is just like, is said there, it's just a lane that's a part of the roadway where a bike is designated to be located. A separated bike lane provides a little bit extra buffer between the vehicular traffic and the cyclist. But again, this isn't something that's just going to serve a student. This is going to serve the whole community. So that's also another type of infrastructure that might be appropriate for your safe routes to school initiatives. So there are a bunch of other types of countermeasures. We go into a lot more detail on these with some specific information on each of them, such as funding range and maintenance ease and things like that in our webinar. But for the sake of time today, we listed some of the others that are either less common or require a bit more explanation, which you could get in the webinar there. But there are a lot of different ways to go about addressing the ability of children to safely get to and from school. And so you could use a combination of these infrastructure countermeasures or just one-off. It just depends on what your maintenance capacity is and what kind of funding assistance you receive and what your community describes as their needs when you're doing your school travel plan process. So next we'll talk a little bit about some resources for actually designing your safe routes to school projects. Again, if you're a planner or an engineer, these resources are probably pretty familiar to you. It never hurts to have a refresher or reminder that they exist. If you're from a school district or a community member, volunteer, you may not be as familiar with these. I would suggest you download the handout and click on these links and flip through some of these resources. Some of them are really beautiful and interesting to look at. Others are just very enlightening to understand how bicycle and pedestrian planning and engineering processes are outlined, and then to understand how each of these different types of countermeasures is intended to be used. So, we have the American with Disabilities Act standards for accessible design. This is something that's a crux of planning and engineering for all communities. We have the National Association of City Transportation Officials, or NACTO, Urban Street Design Guide. They also have a bicycle design guide. They have a rural street design guide. There's a variety of different ones out there. And then there's some others here, like the AASHTO Guide for Development of Bicycle Facilities, which is obviously specific to bike facilities. And then if you are a small town or a rural community, you might be interested in the FHWA Guide for Small Town and Rural Multimodal Networks, as well as other guides that they have available on their website. So these are worth looking at either before you start your school travel planning process, just to get an idea of what kind of resources are out there, or if you've already done one of those processes or have another type of transportation or active transportation planning process underway, these are really great resources. So once you do your school travel plan, you apply for funding, you get your funds, how do you actually use them? How do you implement what you identified in your school travel plan and other safe routes to school related planning efforts? So we'll spend a little bit of time here just talking about this. We're getting close to the end of the content for today's webinar, so be thinking about your questions. First of all, we're thinking about how do you actually ensure that your safe routes to school projects and programs, once funded, are going to be overseen effectively and implemented appropriately, and not just be wasted, or a plan's just not sitting on a shelf collecting dust. And so in order to do that, we recommend that you have a strong safe routes to school team. And so this team is likely going to be the stakeholders that you pulled together for your school travel plan. It could be a group of folks, a committee that you already have in place, but regardless, just letting them know that they are tasked with ensuring that these safe routes to school projects and programs are actually implemented, that the funding is used appropriately, and that your community is actually meeting its safe routes to school needs. And so this team would meet regularly. It would have representatives that could know about or speak about the infrastructure and non-infrastructure types of projects you might be implementing, and have a broad range of members. So to my point earlier, it's not just the parents and guardians of the students. It's not just the school staff. It's a combination of both of those, plus other representation throughout the community, business owners, people from the actual jurisdiction you're located in, the Parks and Rec department, planning department, engineering department, you name it. There is a toolkit for this that, probably not to your surprise, ODOT Safe Routes to School program has created. And so you can click on this link in the handout and it'll take you to ODOT Safe Routes to School page. And it gives you a step-by-step guide to how to develop your program, specifically about a multidisciplinary Safe Routes to School team who is suggested to be invited, how to make that request of participation. And then it also includes that safe route, that school travel plan template. So be sure to check that out. It's a really great resource out there. And to my point earlier, if you want to use this, there is no reason not to, but if you like to create your own things from scratch, you're welcome to do that as well. But it might still be helpful to see what ODOT talks about in this guide. So the ODOT Safe Routes to School website, like I had mentioned already, has information on how to apply for funding. So, as I said earlier, ODOT can provide up to 100% of funding for all phases of a project. You can apply for both infrastructure and non-infrastructure funding through an online application on ODOT's website. The application window typically opens at the beginning of each year in early January and lasts through early March. The notice of awards is usually sent out in early June, so think about that timeline for your planning purposes. In your online application, you'll need to provide information and describe some things, such as what's listed here in these bullet points. The whole idea is that you're going to be asked how this particular project or program directly impacts students and how it's going to develop a more complete network for walking and biking to school. And you'll have to identify the number of bicycle and pedestrian involved crashes within a 2-mile radius of the school in the past 5 years. And you'll have to reflect on how the proposed project is going to address specific safety issues and improve that safety for students. You also have to talk about the community need, and this is going to be indicated by providing some more data. And again, there are tools and resources through ODOT's Safe Routes to School program to help you do this, either to guide you to do it yourself if you have that capacity and interest in doing so. And there's also opportunities for ODOT to assist with doing those things. So it's not meant to be difficult, it's just meant to be comprehensive and to ensure that whatever Safe Routes to School projects and programs you initiate are going to be utilized to their full potential and serve the needs of your community. So, I had mentioned that in your application and through your school travel planning process, you're going to have to be collecting different data and information. And one great resource is the Safe Routes to School district coordinators. And so on ODOT's website, there is a page where you can find your district coordinator. They are a great resource. all the way through the process. Kate is always a point of contact for questions. Your district coordinator is going to know a lot of the particularities for the work that goes on in your community. There are also tools available on ODOT's website to help you collect the data that will go into your application and that will inform your school travel plan. One of the most common and one of the ones that you might want to use for other things that you do is the TIMS Active Transportation Map Viewer. So this is an interactive web map on ODOT's web mapping portal that displays information about a variety of data points. So everything from school district boundaries to municipality boundaries to different types of roadway network information. It shows where ongoing Safe Routes to School projects are located and a variety of other things, crash data. There's an equity indicator. There's information on active transportation demand. So some of this information is already collated for you. Some of it is really easily available there to click so that you can produce different maps and different statistics to inform your process and your application. So this is what the TIMS looks like. It's pixelated, obviously, because I zoomed it in, but it's really meant to be user-friendly, whether you are familiar with more robust mapping tools or if you are just a Google mapper, you will be able to use this, and you are able to click on different types of layers of information and get your information just right up there so you can see it. And then you can also click on all these little points and it'll show you information. You can download Excel spreadsheets. It's all there for you to use, and ODOT's team is always happy to answer questions. And then, again, I'll just say that the Active Transportation Academy is always here to support you as well. We offer a school travel planning workshop if you would find that to be useful, if you just don't know where to start and just want a little bit more assistance from the get-go. You can always do other in-person trainings or virtual trainings if you already have a Safe Routes to School project in mind or a program that's been funded for crossing guards or for your educational efforts such as Girls in Gear programs, Safe Routes to School lesson guides and whatnot. And then there's also the e-learning courses there for your absorption, which can be helpful, whether you're pulling in your Safe Routes to School team and want to lead them here to take the Safe Routes to School Basics e-learning course, or if you want to host that workshop, we're always happy to help you with that. There are other national resources. The Safe Routes to School Partnership is a great place to go to get more information. There's the National Active Transportation Equity Work Group, which speaks a lot to all of the different intentions of the Safe Routes to School program. US DOT has Safe Routes to School information. There's the actual Safe Routes to School guide linked there, and then there's an entity called Change Lab Solutions that has Safe Routes to School resources as well. And again, if you download the handout, these links will take you directly to the appropriate pages. So last but not least, once you've gone through your whole Safe Routes to School planning and funding process, there's also an opportunity to integrate Safe Routes to School into other planning efforts. Whether you already do Safe Routes to School work or you don't, this is a great opportunity. So if you are a community doing active transportation planning or working on a complete streets plan or a comprehensive plan, you can integrate Safe Routes to Schools into that by looking specifically at school locations, at the infrastructure conditions around there, integrating walk audits and surveys to parents and caregivers and the school itself within those processes. And you can feed two birds with one muffin that way. Or if you're a school district, for example, and you're working on a wellness policy, Safe Routes to School is integral in that, from what I was referring to earlier with obesity and respiratory illnesses and children growing day by the day. That's a great way to help combat that. If you are a school district and you are on the facilities side and you're working on future school siting plans, where are you going to put your schools? This is a great opportunity as well to take a look at the active transportation infrastructure around those sites, or the opportunities to build sidewalks or multi-use paths and bike facilities in those new school locations. Where are the children located? What's the closest you can get the school to them? What's the path of least resistance for them to get to the school and whatnot? So there are a lot of ways to integrate Safe Routes to School into your efforts, whether you're doing it officially through a Safe Routes to School process, or if you are looking out for the health and safety of the students through your other initiatives. So you can also use these other planning initiatives to, be the eligible plan that's occurred in the past 5 years for your ODOT funding. And so you need to make sure you do a few things, and these are all similar to what you would be including in your school travel plan if you went that route. But you need to make sure that you document that you've engaged the community. You have to make sure that you document specific information relevant to school travel. You have to make sure that you are including infrastructure and non-infrastructure projects and programs, and you have to make sure that this other planning effort has been completed within the past 5 years of your funding application. So this is also a great opportunity to reach out to Kate and ask her if a plan that you already have done would meet those eligibility requirements. So with that, I am going to invite Kate Harley, who is our Safe Routes to School manager at ODOT, to join. And I think that there were some questions posed in the chat pod, and we can cover those. And then if anyone else has questions, this is a great time to ask them. So.
Sounds good.
Yep.
Thanks so much, Amelia. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay. Great. Well, yeah, thanks for providing that overview. It looks like we've had a couple questions coming through the chat pod. So, please go ahead and continue to send those questions, and we'll do our best to answer those live. I'm also happy to follow up with more information as needed. I did want to just emphasize some of the, kind of potential next steps available. This webinar was just to sort of bring some more attention to Safe Routes to School, have an opportunity for those of you who might be interested, in working with schools and communities on helping kids walk and bike to school, to kind of have a place to come, ask your questions. But we do have an e-learning that's available through our online system. So would definitely encourage you to check that out. For those of you who might be interested in requesting a more personalized workshop to help you get started on developing a school travel plan, that is an opportunity that's out there as well. And that online e-learning is a prerequisite. Another thing you might be interested in is some of the walk audit opportunities as well to help you get started. And then of course your community can apply for actual consultant assistance to develop a school travel plan when the application opens between January and March of 2022. Okay, so let's get to the questions. We had one question come in, just I think to talk a little bit about if there's data out there that kind of discusses or sheds light on if it's safer for younger students to ride their bikes on the sidewalk or in the street. So that's a good question. And it's interesting because when we talk about adults riding, we tend to direct people to ride on the roads. We, have concerns about adult bicyclists riding on sidewalks for a variety of reasons. you know, related to visibility and the number of conflict points that they might be entering into when it comes to driveways or intersections, or even just sort of the speed of a bicyclist on a sidewalk, you know, may not be what people are anticipating. But when we talk about younger students, sidewalks are absolutely open to, you know, the K through 8 populations, sidewalks across the state. There's no statewide ban on biking on sidewalks, and most communities would only require adults or people over a certain age to not be on the sidewalk. So sidewalks are a potential facility. I think some of the challenges could just be how busy those sidewalks are, the quality of those sidewalks, the width of those sidewalks. Obviously, a wider sidewalk would be preferred to support both walking and biking around schools. A preferred facility would probably be a path, which tends to be, you know, 10 feet wide and really facilitate that bidirectional traffic more comfortably. But just in general, depending on the community, depending on, you know, your roadways volumes and speeds and, you know, the infrastructure available, depending on whether children are traveling with families or alone, you know, there's probably a variety of facilities that could support kids walking and biking to school. 25-mile-per-hour road with really low volume, maybe some traffic calming treatments that kind of keeps traffic speeds managed, could be appropriate for certain students. And of course, providing options is always helpful. Having the sidewalk option, having bike lane options so that students can, you know, use the facilities that they feel most comfortable on. Let's see.
I see the question from Lacey about what is Vision Zero. Lacey, Vision Zero is a nationwide initiative, if you will, to aim to have zero traffic-related deaths. I think that's the one-sentence summary. Kate, I don't know if you would add to that, but there are actually Vision Zero plans that are done. The Active Transportation Academy offers a training for creating your own Vision Zero plan. Kate, what about from ODOT's perspective with Vision Zero?
Yeah, I would just say typically, like, as we work with communities on Vision Zero related initiatives, whether that's, you know, we've seen communities adopt, you know, Vision Zero like policy statements or developing Vision Zero plans, you know, this tends to really be focused on identifying a high injury network within your community, really like a localized approach to reducing traffic fatalities and serious injuries. So identifying those high injury networks, really focused on reducing those conflicts. And I think, you know, working closely in a local community on engineering and policy and a variety of, you know, things that are really focused on safety. Safety is definitely a huge part of Safe Routes to School, but I would also just say that from a Safe Routes to School perspective, we're looking also at, you know, connectivity and comfort and convenience. So making walking and biking the easy option, the comfortable, convenient option, making sure that facilities are, you know, specifically going to make it possible and comfortable for that K-8 population. So beyond just like a super focus on safety, you know, just sort of adding in that just general access and mobility piece as well.
Kate, do you have any experience working with communities who have local transit agencies in their Safe Routes to School efforts and working with them to improve transit stops?
Yeah, so one, I would say in terms of Safe Routes to School program, you know, with the limited funding we have to offer, it's really, really focused on walking and biking. So for communities, I'm trying to think through this question. I think it makes a lot of sense for communities where students might be utilizing the public, like the current public transit, for that to be considered within planning. So if we know that students are arriving to a lot of their schools at these certain transit stops and prioritizing those routes that students might be taking for that last, you know, the last mile or hopefully less than a mile connection that they might be making, I think is a great idea. I might be able to connect you with some communities that could speak to that a little bit more. But in general, there has sometimes had questions come up related to like school bus safety or other things. We really tend to focus our resources on projects that are going to help kids walk and bike to school and arrive to school on foot or on bike. Another question coming in is the 5-mile radius only for public schools. Does it include private schools as well? So just want to make sure we are focused on a 2-mile radius from schools. When we think about private schools, I know we're kind of coming up here in the last couple minutes, so continue to put in your questions, but just want to address the public-private school topic really quickly. I would say within your local community, you know, if you're working on a school travel plan or some other equivalent plan, this is, you know, your community's plan for enabling students to walk and bike to school. So it's absolutely appropriate to include all of those schools, public and private, as your community seeks to do that. And you can submit projects that would address private school connectivity to the Safe Routes to School program, but we do have some limitations in terms of, you know, the applicant cannot be a private entity. Any infrastructure needs to be available to the public 24/7. And just in general, like we tend to see, this may not be the case for you, but we tend to see that public schools might be drawing in more students from a walkable and bikeable distance. They might also have greater need for assistance. So when we think about just like competitive applications, sometimes there's just more natural competitiveness that comes with public schools. So really depends on your local community and schools. But from a planning perspective, I think there's a lot of benefits to being comprehensive in addressing school connectivity, and there could be a lot of overlap as well with public and private. All right, that was really quick, but if you have additional information, our emails are on the screen. We're happy to answer any additional questions you have. And then of course, you know, district Safe Routes to School coordinators are available at each of our district offices and are a great frontline resource. So thanks for joining.
Yeah, thank you, everybody.
All right. Thanks, Amelia and Caitlin, and thanks everybody for your participation today.
Thanks, have a good one.